There are people throughout the world that have interesting stories to tell. Stories of heroism, acts of kindness, near-death experiences, successes, and failures. You usually hear of these stories from people that live in another state or country. But what about the stories from within your own community? Everyone has a story to tell. And by everyone, we mean your neighbor, your coworker, the person behind you at church, people you interact with on a daily basis, or maybe even you.
Welcome to the DTB Podcast, presented by the Bless Your Heart Nonprofit Corporation. I'm Brennan Matherne, and I'll be your host as we speak to some of the most interesting people on Bayou Lafourche. On Highway 308 and Cutoff, just south of the South Lafourche Bridge, you'll find the administrative offices of the Greater Lafourche Port Commission. But before the port purchased the property, there once stood the old Jet Cinema. Or at least that's what I remember it growing up as a kid on Bayou Lafourche in the 80s and 90s. It was always a treat to know when a major movie came out that we had a place to watch it right here on Bayou Lafourche. Today we're speaking with Dennis Guidry, whose family owned and operated the Jet Cinema, to tell us a little bit about the history of the cinema and theater in general on Bayou Lafourche. Dennis, welcome, and thank you so much for joining us.
Good afternoon, sir.
We appreciate you coming by, and as we do every time when we start any show, we always want to hear about you and your family. So tell us who's your mom and dad, and tell us a little bit about your family so we can get to know you.
My dad was Dick Guidry, my mom Phyllis. I've got a brother and three sisters, and my dad was in theater business. He was in the oil business. He was in the tugboat business, realty. So he was a lot of hats.
And of course, not needless to mention, the one that we most know him by, for the most part, as state representative, one of the youngest in the state when he was elected.
The youngest
in the state. At what, 23 years old?
22. He still holds the record.
Wow. So obviously the name Dick Guidry, a lot of people know, but not everybody realized that he and your family were in the theater business and really a long history, not just with the Jet Cinema, but way back. So you had actually served and led several theater associations. So can you give us a little bit of the history of theaters and drive-ins on the Bayou? And you got to tell us about this thing called the show bus.
Well, back in up to about 1929, 1930, there was a touring company that would come down every once in a while. Mr. Joy Hawk was the owner, and he'd have a tent show, kind of like what you hear about the old revivals, except he'd be showing movies. And my dad liked to tell the joke that they'd be watching the movie, and of course it was a silent movie at that time, and somebody would be talking, and somebody would yell out, "Shut up! I can't read the movie." So then they have the whole audience laughing. Well, Mr. Hawk convinced my grandfather, John Guidry, that he should open up a theater. So in 1932, the Star Theater was built. At that time, you had a total of 6 theaters in the 10th Ward.
Wow.
Going from down the bayou, you had the Buccaneer. That was somewhere around where Randolph's used to be. And those who don't know, Randolph is just south of the Golden Meadow Middle School. You had the Repstock Theater, and of course, run by the Repstocks. You had the Rio Theater. I don't know if you're familiar with the first building in Golden Meadow going down the bayou. There was a fence, and then there's a white building.
Right.
That was the theater. I really haven't noticed if it's still there or not. Then in Galliana, you had the Star Theater. Then you had Lee Brothers, which was right across from the dance hall. And then you had the Joy Theater in La Rose, which was owned by the Boulets. And it had the unique construction to it in that it was built backwards. You know how the floors slope down
right.
in a regular theater? In this one, it sloped up.
Oh, wow.
So I don't know how they showed movies with that concept, but it lasted for a while. As far as the Star Theater went, My grandfather had built it in 1932, and it went through several years of really great business. But close to the mid-'60s, the theater business went through all of this stuff about, the hippie movement, and movies became meaningful to everyone, to people that went to college and had thought philosophical. But to the ordinary person, they weren't worth anything. So they ended up losing business, so they shut it down in that time. Then, but before it was shut down, there was Lefty Cherami, who was married into the Rebstock family, and he booked movies for them, as my dad used to book movies for the Star. And they decided to get together and make the drive-in. And they were looking for a name for the drive-in, and they wanted it to sound modern. And they needed it to be short because neon lights were expensive. So they came up with the Jet, since Jets were just really making their day in the early 50s. And so the Jet Drive-In was born with about 50 seats, 50 car slots, nice concession stand. Bathrooms were a lot to be, let's say they weren't very nice. They did well together at the drive-in. So in '73, they decided to get together and make an indoor movie theater. They thought it was about time to get one back. So they did. The first movie was White Lightning, and it was the first time anybody, or the lamp line for the White Lightning went from the theater to the end of the parking lot, turn left, and about another 100, 200 feet. And that was just for the 6:30 show.
Wow. I've definitely seen some long lines, depending on the movie, outside of the Jet Cinema, even in the 80s and 90s. But it was always specific, probably something that was just really hyped up. And I'll definitely get into that in a minute, because I'm sure you have some good memories of specific movies that came there. But you mentioned that you guys, before the cinema, your family started all the way back in the Star Theater with your grandfather. How did the idea come about with your family to bring theaters to the Bayou, to get into this business, and why was it so popular?
Well, like I was saying, my grandfather used to own the John L. Guidry supermarket. Across the parking lot, there was where the place where they built the Star, and then next to that, my grandfather had a place that was ice cream parlor in the front with the bar room in the back. In those days, if you could reach the counter, you could get a beer. But my grandfather's bar used to open up like at 6 in the morning and close at nightfall. He wasn't interested in having the nightlife there. He was there to, guys working on the boats come in, they want to have a drink before going home. And so it was never a rowdy place. Joy Hawk would come down with this tent, and he would find somebody with a lot of land, and he'd set up for a week or so, and he'd run a movie there. Didn't have to bring any sound equipment because they were silent movies. Mr. Hawk spoke to my grandfather quite often, and he would say, this place needs another theater. I'm not sure if if the Star was the first one or not, but I think they did probably the best business. As you mentioned before, the Star Theater, and I believe the Rebstock, had a bus that would go out and pick up patrons for the theater and bring them back home after the movie. So it was a pretty interesting time. In those days, they'd pick up a film for $30, $40, whereas by the end of it, theaters were having to pay 70, 60% of their ticket income to the movie companies.
And just in the last 10 to 20 years, we've seen the amount that these movies are grossing almost double and triple. When I think about the first Spider-Man movie coming out and talking about $100 million, and then, or 116, whatever it was, and then now the Avengers and everything that's come out later. I mean, we're talking about 2 and 3 and 4 times that. And it's been amazing to watch that progression, but all the records continue to get broken because of how much money they're bringing in.
Well, if you could look at the ticket sales instead, you'd see it steady going down. The dollar figure's going up because now you're paying $15 as an adult.
Right.
Some places $20. And when I closed the Jet Cinema, it was still, I'm trying to remember, it was either $5 and $2.50 or $6 and $3. $6 an adult, $3 for a child. And then we had Tuesdays was all discount night. Everybody came in for the $3. Same thing for any matinee that we had.
So speaking of which, I've never been to a drive-in at all. I've never been to a drive-in movie, and I hope I can at some point in the future. But how did ticket sales work for that? What did a ticket cost, and what was that experience like?
In those days, I think the tickets were only $3 or $4, and they would charge anybody 13 and up would have to pay the ticket, which is, like I said, $3 or $4, and they wouldn't charge for children because most of the time children would fall asleep before. And a lot of times the parents came in so they could get the kids to fall asleep. And of course you had some kids sometimes try to sneak people in the trunk, and quite often they did. I know several of my friends told me how they got in. You'd come in, get your ticket, go and find a space that you want. If you're with your family, you were probably somewhere in the first four rows. If you were with your girlfriend, probably in the last 4 or 5 rows. Concession stand, anything from popcorn to chili, a ton of different kind of candies. There was nothing for a diabetic in there, though.
Well, and you touched on something that I want to ask you about, and that is the chili. I've seen and heard about the Jet Drive-In chili, and of course we're talking about the drive-in, not the Jet Cinema, but the drive-in. And I've heard about this chili, so you got to tell me what was special about it, and why was it so popular?
Chili was good. I mean, it's. I've seen the recipe before. I don't have it anymore. I wish I did. But there's a lot of greens in it. But it was chopped so fine that you really couldn't see them in the chili. So actually, I think it's, if you're going to have chili, that one was healthy for you. We did bring it to the cinema. I forget who was the first person to make the chili, but I know the last person was Mrs. Brennan Matherne. Edmund was a projectionist for me, and his wife used to go ahead and do cook the chili for the cinema. And the people loved that as much as they loved the drive-in chili. It was the same recipe. She knew it by heart. And so we had the chili, and we had people stop just for the chili.
So let's talk about that period when the cinema actually opened before the drive-in closed down.
Right.
So tell us a little bit about the transition, about why did y'all decide to open the cinema, and ultimately what led to the drive-in closing down.
The cinema, it was basically my dad and Lefty Shermy had gotten together, and they felt that since all the other theaters had shut down, that it was time for a new movie theater in our area. And by judging by White Lightning, there was a lot of people waiting for it. Come the 80s and 90s, business started to really slow down quite a bit. There was a couple of films here or there that did real well, but mostly it was very slow. The drive-in ended up closing because we were close to the end of the lease for the property, and we had, I guess, about a 20-knot wind straight into the screen. And within a couple of seconds, the wind whipped around, and it was like over 20 knots coming back on the other side of the screen. And let's just say the screen should have been repainted several years before, because then the plate metal that was made of the screen just kind of broke down piece by piece, straight down. Thankfully, straight down. When giving back the patrons money, one guy was like, "Oh man, I thought it was part of the show." So that was the end of the drive-in. I mean, it was just be another 50, 60, somewhere around $50,000 to build another one, and we only had 1 year on the lease. Business hadn't been so good, but what really got us is that 2 weeks before, we had put in a stereo FM system. You think about it. People have a better FM radio in their car than they do at their home.
Mm-hmm.
And you just tune into a certain station and you get it. And now today it wouldn't draw anything, but at that time, we didn't have VHS even. So we had Caddyshack and Airplane as a double bill coming that Friday. Wow. And it went down to Wednesday.
Unreal. We started to talk about the cinema, and anytime I think of the cinema, I think about walking in. The first thing that hits you is that incredible smell of popcorn, which is true about many cinemas, at least ones that have good popcorn. But I understand that there was someone named Teen Ann that cooked all the popcorn at the cinema. So can you tell us about her?
Teen Ann's real name was Julia Guidry, and she was my grandfather's sister. She used to work for my grandfather's store, the supermarket, and she'd work at the store, whatever needed to be done. She made lunches for people for around lunchtime. Then she'd walk over to the Star Theater, pop popcorn, then go into the ticket booth, sell tickets. Then after the movie starts, she'd go back and pop popcorn. And then she had retired for a while. And then when they've opened up the cinema, the Jet, my father and Lefty basically got her to come back to pop just the popcorn. That's all she had to do. And believe me, I could tell you the secret to making great popcorn. Have the cleanest doggone machine you can have. She cleaned that machine at every break. If we had 4 movies, she cleaned it 4 times. She'd come in, she'd pop 2 or 3 batches of popcorn, wipe down the machine. When she was finally around 75 or so, 75, 80, she decided she needed a break. So instead of working every night, she started working 7 and 7. And then when she hit around just before late 80s, she decided it was time to retire. But I was blessed with great workers.
Yeah.
And the thing is, I had only high school kids working for me, and except I had Teen Ann and an aunt working for a while. But mostly of the people that I hired, there was only 2 guys that were out of school, and the rest of them were in high school. And I tell you what, they were the hardest working kids I've ever seen.
Wow. Other than the treats like chili and popcorn, the thing that can bring in the people is obviously the main attraction, the movie itself. So over the years, we've seen some major titles. Obviously, most of the major titles come to the Jet Cinema, and I'm sure the drive-in before my time. Can you remember from your personal experience? Do you have some memories or some stories about some of the movies with the biggest hype, or just movies that brought in the biggest crowds, or just any memorable movies that came through that you can talk about?
This is something that happened back in the 50s at the drive-in. You remember the MASH episode where they talked about the movie The Moon is Blue?
I don't, but that was a little before. I remember watching MASH as a kid, but that's about as far as I could go.
This movie was banned in several cities because of risque language. And my dad, they went ahead and booked it for the drive-in. And lo and behold, the film lasts 4 weeks. That was unheard of. Meaning these days, the drive-in had a show Monday, Tuesday, Wednesday. Bank night was another show, usually a pretty lousy one because it was going to have a big crowd anyway. And then Thursday, and then Friday, Saturday. So usually 3 movies a week. This was 1 movie for 4 weeks. Well, after it played out at the drive-in, Lefty decided to book it at the Rebstock, and he played it for 3 weeks. Again, same type of schedule.
Right.
Then finally my dad said, well, let me try it at the Star. Maybe it hasn't played out. And he had 2 good weeks with it. And in those days, when they booked that movie, they only paid 35% of their ticket gross. Well, after the hype really came out, they tried to book it again, except now they wanted 65% of the gross. And they went, no, we've already played it out over here.
Yeah. What about at the cinema? Was there any major films that came through that attracted the major crowds that you can recall?
The 3 films that we ended up having the largest crowds for was, of course, E.T. We played a total of 9 weeks, but it took 3 years for that 9 weeks. And then Home Alone was a big film that wasn't supposed to do much. And we did 9 weeks with beautiful business. We did real well. And then when Glenn Pete wanted to premiere his Bel-Azer the Cajun, we played that one for 9 weeks. And again, it did extremely well. You'd have to imagine it would, because half of the audience that came were in it.
Right. Yeah, three films that certainly I'm sure a lot of people, especially my generation, can relate to. For one, the latter being, of course, a local filmmaker with local people in it. But for me, E.T., I'd have to double check with my parents, but I have to believe that was my first film I ever saw in a theater. And Home Alone is a classic, obviously, when I was a kid, and has become my wife and I know it's my wife and I's favorite Christmas movie. But it's incredible. I've always been a huge movie fan, and it's always awesome how, talking about movies, quoting movies is always something that will stick around in society and is always part of it. And your cinema was that place where people got to make those memories, got to experience those things for the first time. So speaking of memories, over the years, were there ever, and we can go back to the drive-in or even the early theaters, but were there any celebrities or movie stars that ever came through and visited the locations?
Well, back in the 50s, once in a while they'd have the star actor in the movie go around do the circuit, as they said,
right,
with the movie, and they'd make appearance and sign autographs and such. The only one that I know of that the star had for sure was Marcus the Magnificent. But we didn't have a whole lot of stars. Now, I was a member of the National Association of Theater Owners for several years, and I went to the conventions for several of them, and there we saw quite a few big actors. I've seen Stallone, Sharon Stone, Eddie Murphy, but I've seen quite a bit of big movie stars there, and they were fun to go to. And the last 2 years I was member of NATO, I was on their board of directors, and that was all business. That's when the ADA, the American Disabilities Act, was floating around, and for the theaters that meant a big financial change in what you do at your theaters. That had quite a bit of cost. And then for the state, I was the president of the Louisiana Association of Theater Owners for 2 years. And our big thing is we ended up having to fight the state because they wanted to collect taxes off of our sales tax. What we paid the film companies. So it would be we pay taxes for selling the ticket, then we have to pay taxes for leasing the equipment, for renting the film, and we were able to get that knocked out, because that with any theater, our theater, it meant like something like $10,000. So a theater in New Orleans or something like that, you're talking hundreds of thousands.
Now, going back to your beginning, you took over the theater in the '80s, and and we understand that there wasn't always two screens. There used to be one screen there.
We took over the theater we bought out Lefty Shermy in '79, and then in '82, we went ahead and I was able to talk my dad into making two screens. And that's when we had 434 seats before, and we ended up with 212 and 213 on the 20. We lost a lot less than what we thought we would. And we had never done over 190,000. And right after that, we started hitting $250,000. Sounds bigger that way.
Yeah.
It's not as much as you think it is.
Well, ultimately, your family, and you've talked about some of the issues as time has gone on, and ultimately your family did get out of the business when the cinema closed in October of '95. Looking toward the future, I guess looking at, and especially what we went through in this past year, and a lot of people, we couldn't go to the theaters. A lot of people had to stay home, and we know streaming has taken off and is in a world of its own now. But forcing people out of the theaters for the past year, and with all the technology we have, what do you see as the future of the theater industry? And on top of that, do you think we could ever see a theater or a drive-in on the Bayou again?
Well, theaters are extremely expensive to build. The original cost for just that one screen building and equipment was about $250,000. Right now, I know people spending close to $1 million per screen for the seats. You have to have the deluxe seats, the rocking chair seats, the cup holders, and the sound systems that separate the sound better. I mean, I was one of the first 10 theaters in Louisiana that put in a stereo sound. And that was just left, right, and surround sound. Well, now it's not, surround sound is divided between left and right too. So that makes a big difference. If you want somebody walking across the room or a jet flying by, then you could have that sound. Because of the cost, and I've got friends that are still in the movie business, and they're having problems right now. They really don't know themselves what's going on. Especially when film companies will go ahead and let you get it on a pay channel, but then they're going to charge the movie theater 70% of the gross to rent the film, and you're seeing it at home for $10 with as many. If you want 50 people there, $10. That's it. And some places, I mean, I know of at least one friend that has basically a movie room. I mean, if he wants to put a 7-8 foot projection on his wall, it's no big deal. So cinema, I don't see a movie cinema theater coming in anywhere in Lafourche Parish anytime in the near future, or even in probably not the further future. And this is from somebody that would love to be in the business again. That was the best job in the world, next to playing music also. But drive-in, it's a novelty now.
Right.
Believe it or not, there are drive-ins in Mississippi and Alabama. Florida's got 3 or 4 of them. And what they do instead of having just one screen, the smallest drive-in I've seen still open right now has 2 screens. There's one of them I know that has 4. And the thing that we couldn't do, the drive-ins are able to. A cinema, you can't show 2 for 1. You can't have a double feature in a cinema anymore, unless you're having using retro films. But a drive-in can have 2 first-run movies on the same screen.
Oh, wow.
And you want to stay for both of them? Fine. You want to stay for one? Fine. Whichever. It's all the same price. So drive-in has a little bit more leeway, and all you need is a lot of land, which is a big expense right there. So, yeah. Somebody that has a big plot of land and they want to put a drive-in there, let me know. I'll be more than happy to manage it for them.
Yeah. All right. Well, Dennis, at the end of every podcast, we have a round of rapid-fire questions for each guest, and as you might expect, they're related to life on the bayou. You can give us a one-word answer or expand on your answer if you feel you need to explain. It's entirely up to you. Are you ready?
Okay.
All right. What's your go-to order at a down-the-bayou restaurant?
Gotta be shrimp.
Shrimp? Any particular way?
Preferably grilled.
Grilled shrimp. That does sound good. Potato salad. In the gumbo or on the side?
Back in the serving plate.
So
I'm not a potato salad guy.
Okay. Jambalaya, red or brown?
Prefer brown jambalaya, but red's all right.
Red's all right. What's your favorite Cajun French word or phrase and its meaning?
Wish I'd bet.
Which means?
Such a thing, yeah.
What's your favorite snowball flavor?
It's still bubblegum.
Bubblegum. Yeah, that's one of my favorites. All right, now here's the kicker. When a boat is passing and you're in the car, is the bridge open or closed?
We used to say the bridge is open when the boats would pass.
Right.
But now that we don't have as many boats coming through, I'm hearing more people say the bridge is closed when the boat's coming and it's open when they're not there.
Well, I'm glad I found some, because that's exactly how I view it. When I was growing up, I did it the exact same way. It was open, and now I think of it as closed. So I guess your point of view may change as time goes on. Well, that'll do it for us for this episode of the DTB podcast. We want to thank you, Dennis, for joining us today. Dennis Guidry, our guest. We really appreciate it, and all the history that we've been able to capture here about the Jet Cinema, Jet Drive-In, and really the history of theaters on Bayou Lafourche. Thanks so much for joining us.
It's been a pleasure.
All right. You can subscribe to the DTB podcast on Apple, Google, Spotify, or wherever you listen to podcasts. You can follow us on Facebook and Twitter at the DTB podcast. You can also follow Bless Your Heart Nonprofit on Facebook or on Twitter at BYH Nonprofit. You can donate to Bless Your Heart on Venmo at Bless Your Heart Nonprofit and on PayPal at blessyourheartnonprofit@gmail.com. That'll wrap it up for us on the DTB podcast. Be sure to hit that subscribe button for our next episode. Until then, this is Brennan Matherne. Thank you for joining us, and we'll see you next time.